On a fog-shrouded morning in October 1823, the residents of Mobile County, Alabama, discovered something that would haunt their community for generations. 7 enslaved individuals had vanished overnight from the Blackwood Plantation, leaving behind only their shackles and a single blood-stained document bearing the seal of Colonel Elias Blackwood. What authorities found in that document would expose a web of betrayal, greed, and calculated cruelty that reached into the highest circles of Southern society. For nearly 2 centuries, the Blackwood family has spent fortunes to keep this story buried, but recently discovered correspondence reveals the true horror of what became known as the Wedding Gift Massacre. The truth about Colonel Elias Blackwood's gift to his bride would destroy not just his own family, but reshape the power structure of an entire region. Before we continue with the story of Colonel Elias Blackwood and his deadly matrimonial arrangement, make sure you're subscribed to our channel for more dark historical mysteries. And let us know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. We love connecting with fellow history enthusiasts who appreciate the shadows of America's past. The document that survived that terrible night would later be described by Mobile's mayor as the most damning piece of evidence of human calculation I have ever witnessed. But understanding its true meaning requires us to journey back to where this nightmare began. Mobile County in 1822 represented everything the antebellum South aspired to become. Cotton plantations stretched across the landscape like green seas, their profits funding grand mansions and elaborate social gatherings that mimicked European aristocracy. Among the plantation elite, few commanded more respect than Colonel Elias Blackwood, a man whose military service in the War of 1812 had earned him both honor and substantial land grants. Blackwood possessed the calculating mind of a born strategist. Standing well over 6 feet tall with penetrating gray eyes and a precisely groomed beard, he commanded attention in every room he entered. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience, whether from soldiers under his command or the 200 enslaved individuals who worked his vast cotton fields. Those who knew him described a man of rigid principles and unwavering determination, qualities that had built his fortune and would ultimately orchestrate his downfall. The Blackwood Plantation encompassed over 3,000 acres of prime Alabama soil, worked by enslaved families who had served the family for generations. Unlike many plantation owners who viewed their human property merely as economic units, Blackwood maintained detailed records on every individual, their skills, their family connections, their personal histories, and, most disturbingly, their estimated monetary value, updated monthly based on market conditions and physical capabilities. His bride-to-be, Miss Amelia Hargrove, came from one of New Orleans' most prominent families. At 23, she possessed both the refined education expected of a Southern lady and an inheritance that would substantially increase the Blackwood holdings. Their engagement, announced in the spring of 1822, was celebrated as a perfect union of military honor and old plantation money. What the wedding guests could not have known was that Amelia harbored ambitions that extended far beyond the traditional role of a plantation wife. During their courtship, conducted through formal visits and carefully chaperoned walks through Blackwood's gardens, Amelia had expressed unusual interest in the management aspects of plantation life. While most ladies of her station concerned themselves with household management and social obligations, she asked detailed questions about crop yields, labor organization, and profit margins. Blackwood, impressed by her business acumen, began sharing information typically reserved for male associates and potential business partners. What emerged was a woman whose intelligence matched her beauty, but whose moral compass had been warped by a childhood surrounded by immense wealth built on human suffering. Amelia's father, Theodore Hargrove, had made his fortune not just through cotton, but through the buying and selling of enslaved individuals across multiple states. She had grown up viewing human beings as commodities to be traded, bred, and disposed of according to market demands. Their wedding, scheduled for October 1822, promised to be the social event of the season. Invitations went out to plantation families from Virginia to Louisiana, and preparations began for a celebration that would last 3 days. Blackwood spared no expense, importing French champagne, hiring musicians from New Orleans, and even commissioning a special set of china from England, bearing the combined Blackwood and Hargrove family crests. But as the wedding approached, Amelia made a request that would set in motion a chain of events that would destroy everything Blackwood had built. During a private dinner in September, she asked her fiancé for something no Southern bride had ever requested as a wedding gift: complete ownership and control over 7 specific enslaved individuals from his plantation. The conversation took place in Blackwood's private study, a room lined with military maps, family portraits, and ledgers documenting every aspect of his plantation empire. Outside, September thunder rolled across the cotton fields as Amelia presented her unusual request with the same calm precision she might use to discuss flower arrangements or menu selections. "My dear Elias," she began, her voice carrying an undertone that made the colonel shift uncomfortably in his leather chair, "I have been considering how best to contribute to our household's prosperity after our marriage. I believe I can be of greater service than you might expect." Blackwood listened as his bride-to-be outlined her proposal with disturbing clinical detail. She wanted 7 specific individuals, a family unit consisting of parents, 3 adult children, and 2 grandchildren transferred to her complete ownership through legal documents that would make her their sole master, independent of her husband's authority. Her reasoning, she explained, was both personal and profitable. "These 7 represent a perfect experimental group," Amelia continued, producing a leather portfolio filled with detailed notes about each individual. "The older generation possesses valuable skills in blacksmithing and textile work. The middle generation includes a woman with exceptional ability in herbal medicine and healing, and a man with remarkable strength suited for the heaviest field work. The children are young enough to be molded according to new training methods I have researched." What Amelia did not initially reveal was the true nature of her experimental methods. Through correspondence with contacts in Cuba and Brazil, she had learned about plantation management techniques considered too extreme even by antebellum Southern standards. These methods involved systematic psychological manipulation, controlled breeding programs, and punishment systems designed to break not just individual will, but family bonds that might interfere with absolute obedience. Blackwood found himself in an unprecedented situation. Amelia's request challenged fundamental assumptions about marriage roles and property ownership that formed the bedrock of Southern society. Wives typically managed household slaves, but they did not own field hands independently, nor did they involve themselves in the brutal calculations required for maximum labor extraction. Yet he was also intrigued by her business proposal. Cotton prices had been fluctuating unpredictably, and plantation owners throughout the region were seeking ways to increase efficiency and reduce costs. If Amelia's methods proved successful, they could be applied across his entire labor force, potentially increasing profits by substantial margins. Over several nights of discussion, they developed what they called the Hargrove method, a comprehensive system for managing enslaved individuals that would maximize both productivity and psychological control. The 7 chosen individuals would serve as test subjects, and their responses would determine whether the methods would be expanded plantation-wide after the wedding. The legal arrangements proved complex and required discretion that extended beyond normal business confidentiality. Blackwood retained Mobile attorney Jonathan Whitaker, a man known for handling sensitive plantation legal matters with absolute discretion. Whitaker drew up documents that would transfer complete ownership of the 7 individuals to Amelia upon their marriage, with provisions that would keep the arrangement secret from other plantation owners and local authorities. What made the arrangement particularly sinister was a clause Amelia insisted upon. The 7 individuals would be relocated to a remote section of the plantation where her experiments could proceed without interference from other enslaved workers or observation by visitors. A separate building, disguised as a textile workshop, would serve as both living quarters and location for implementing the new management techniques. As October approached,
Blackwood convinced himself that his bride's unusual request represented forward-thinking business innovation rather than calculated cruelty. He had built his fortune through calculated risks and strategic thinking, qualities he now recognized in Amelia. Their marriage would be more than a social union. It would be a business partnership designed to revolutionize plantation management throughout the South. What neither of them anticipated was that word of their unusual arrangement would reach ears beyond their trusted circle, setting in motion events that would transform their wedding celebration into something far more sinister. On a clear autumn day, October 15, 1822, Mobile County seemed like a paradise on earth. The Blackwood plantation had been transformed for the wedding celebration, with white silk ribbons adorning the oak trees lining the main drive and tables laden with delicacies arranged across the mansion's expansive grounds. Over 200 guests arrived throughout the morning, their carriages creating a procession that stretched for miles along the country roads. Among the wedding guests were some of the most powerful families in the antebellum South. Governor Wilson himself attended, along with senators, judges, and plantation owners whose combined wealth could influence state and federal legislation. The ceremony took place in the plantation's garden pavilion, with Amelia radiant in imported French silk and Blackwood resplendent in his military dress uniform.
But the true significance of the day would emerge during the gift presentation ceremony, a tradition where the groom publicly announced his wedding present to his bride. Blackwood had planned this moment carefully, understanding that his gift would be discussed in drawing rooms from Virginia to Louisiana for months to come. Standing before the assembled guests, Blackwood called for attention and began what would become the most infamous wedding speech in Alabama history. "My dear friends," he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the garden, "it is customary for a groom to present his bride with jewels, fine clothing, or perhaps a new carriage. But my beloved Amelia has requested something far more practical and forward-thinking." The crowd listened with growing fascination as Blackwood described his gift: the legal ownership of 7 enslaved individuals, chosen specifically for their diverse skills and potential for what he termed innovative management approaches. He spoke of his bride's business acumen and her desire to contribute actively to the plantation's prosperity through improved labor efficiency methods. What the guests heard was a respected military officer praising his wife's entrepreneurial spirit and commitment to plantation improvement. What they could not have known was that at that very moment, the 7 individuals in question were being forcibly separated from their families and relocated to the remote building where Amelia's experiments would begin immediately following the wedding celebration. The reaction among the wedding guests was mixed, but generally positive. Several plantation owners approached Blackwood throughout the evening to inquire about Amelia's methods, expressing interest in similar arrangements with their own wives. The idea of involving educated Southern ladies more directly in plantation management struck many as a progressive adaptation to changing economic conditions. However, not everyone present viewed the announcement favorably. Dr. Theodore Montgomery, the county physician who had treated enslaved individuals on multiple plantations, found himself deeply disturbed by the clinical language Blackwood used when describing human beings as experimental subjects and management test cases. Similarly, Reverend Josiah Blackwell, whose congregation included several plantation families, recognized something fundamentally wrong with treating marriage gifts as opportunities for what sounded like systematic cruelty. As the evening progressed and champagne flowed freely, Amelia herself provided additional details that should have alarmed more guests than they did. She spoke enthusiastically about breaking family dependencies that interfere with labor efficiency and establishing new psychological frameworks for absolute obedience. Her words were delivered with the same cheerful tone she used when discussing flower arrangements or menu planning, making their sinister implications easy for intoxicated listeners to overlook. The wedding celebration continued for 3 days as planned, with elaborate dinners, dancing, and entertainment that would be remembered as one of the finest social gatherings in the region's history. But while guests enjoyed themselves in the main mansion, work had already begun in the remote building where the 7 enslaved individuals faced the beginning of Amelia's experimental program. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Mobile County intensified. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this.
Let's discover together what happens next in this tale of calculated cruelty and its devastating consequences. The true nature of Amelia's methods would not become apparent to the outside world for several months, but the 7 individuals subjected to her experiments understood immediately that they had become victims of something far more sinister than typical plantation brutality. The building Amelia had designated for her experimental program sat approximately 2 miles from the main plantation house, connected by a narrow path that wound through dense pine forest. Originally constructed as a tobacco drying barn during the plantation's early years, it had been extensively modified according to Amelia's detailed specifications during the summer months leading up to her wedding. The structure now featured reinforced walls, barred windows set too high to provide views of the surrounding area, and a series of small rooms designed to house individuals in isolation when Amelia deemed necessary for her psychological manipulation techniques. Most disturbing was a central chamber she referred to as the instruction room.
Equipped with restraining devices and punishment apparatus that went far beyond anything typically found on even the harshest plantations, the 7 individuals chosen for Amelia's experiment represented 3 generations of a family that had served the Blackwood plantation for over 30 years. Elijah and Hannah Brooks, both in their 50s, possessed valuable skills as a blacksmith and seamstress, respectively. Their 3 adult children, Jacob, aged 28, Eliza, aged 26, and Nathan, aged 24, had been trained in various plantation tasks and were considered among the most reliable workers on the property. Eliza's 2 young children, ages 6 and 9, completed the family unit. What made this family particularly valuable to Amelia's purposes was their strong emotional bonds and reputation for mutual support during difficult times. Her research had convinced her that breaking these family connections would result in more compliant, productive workers who would focus entirely on their assigned tasks rather than maintaining relationships that might interfere with absolute obedience. Amelia's methods began with systematic isolation, designed to destroy the family's communication and support systems. Each individual was assigned to separate living quarters and forbidden from speaking to other family members except during supervised work periods. Meals were provided at different times to prevent social interaction, and any attempt to communicate resulted in punishment that affected not just the individual involved, but randomly selected family members. The psychological manipulation extended to deliberately false information designed to create mistrust and suspicion among family members. Amelia would tell Elijah that his son Jacob had spoken critically about his father's work performance, while simultaneously informing Jacob that his father had requested additional punishment for his eldest son's alleged laziness. These fabricated reports created tensions and doubts that gradually eroded the trust and affection that had sustained the family through previous hardships. But Amelia's most innovative and cruel technique involved what she called productivity bonding. Family members were forced to compete against each other in various tasks, with the understanding that superior performance by one individual would result in better treatment, while inferior performance would bring punishment not just to the underperformer, but to their loved ones as well. This system transformed natural family loyalty into a source of fear and guilt, as each person's actions directly affected the welfare of those they cared about most. Winter months provided ideal conditions for Amelia's program, as shorter daylight hours meant longer periods of confinement and limited outside contact. She maintained detailed written records of each individual's responses to her various techniques, noting changes in behavior, productivity levels, and signs of psychological breakdown, with the same clinical precision she had once applied to managing her father's household accounts. The physical conditions in the modified building were deliberately harsh, but not immediately life-threatening. Amelia understood that dead or seriously injured subjects would provide no useful data and might attract unwanted attention from other plantation workers or visitors. Instead, she focused on creating constant discomfort and uncertainty that would wear down psychological resistance without causing visible evidence of mistreatment. Food rations were carefully calculated to maintain health while creating perpetual hunger that could be used as both punishment and reward. Sleeping arrangements were designed to prevent rest and recovery, with thin mattresses, inadequate blankets, and deliberately uncomfortable sleeping positions that left individuals exhausted and more susceptible to psychological manipulation.
Throughout the winter months, Amelia visited her experimental subjects daily, always accompanied by 2 trusted overseers who'd been sworn to secrecy about the special arrangements. She would observe their responses to her various techniques, interview each individual separately to assess their psychological state, and adjust her methods based on what she perceived as successful or unsuccessful approaches. What Amelia failed to anticipate was that her systematic cruelty was creating something more dangerous than broken individuals. It was forging a group of people with nothing left to lose and every reason to seek revenge against those who had destroyed their lives. By February 1823, rumors about the mysterious building and its 7 missing occupants had begun circulating through the slave quarters of the main plantation. The Brooks family had been respected members of the community for decades, known for their skills, their strong family bonds, and their willingness to help others during times of illness or personal crisis.
Their sudden disappearance and the strict prohibition against discussing their whereabouts had created an atmosphere of fear and suspicion among the remaining enslaved population. Lydia Freeman, an elderly woman who had served as an unofficial community leader for over 20 years, began quietly gathering information about what had happened to the missing family. Her position as head cook in the main house provided opportunities to overhear conversations between Blackwood, his new wife, and their visitors, while her respected status among the enslaved community made her a natural focal point for concerns and questions. What Lydia learned through careful observation and discreet inquiries painted a picture far more disturbing than typical plantation brutality. The 2 overseers assigned to the remote building had been selected specifically for their reputation for cruelty and their isolation from the main plantation community. Neither man had family connections or close friendships that might create conflicts of loyalty if they were asked to participate in activities that exceeded normal punishment protocols. More troubling were the supplies that had been delivered to the building throughout the winter months. Lydia had observed wagons carrying unusual items, medical instruments that seemed designed for inflicting pain rather than providing treatment, restraining devices that appeared far more sophisticated than typical plantation punishment equipment, and large quantities of materials that suggested extended confinement rather than temporary disciplinary measures. But perhaps most disturbing were the sounds that could occasionally be heard from the direction of the remote building during quiet winter nights. Several plantation workers reported hearing screams and cries that lasted for hours, followed by periods of absolute silence that seemed somehow more ominous than the sounds of obvious suffering. Lydia began organizing what she called prayer circles, gatherings where enslaved individuals would meet in secret to discuss their concerns and share information about the missing family. These meetings served multiple purposes. They provided emotional support for a community living under constant fear. They facilitated the exchange of information that might be useful for survival, and they began to foster a sense of unity and shared purpose that had previously been prevented by the plantation's size and the diverse backgrounds of its workers. Through these gatherings, a picture emerged of Amelia's activities that went far beyond what the wedding guests had heard described as innovative management technique. Reports from those who had observed the building from a distance suggested systematic torture designed not just to punish, but to break the human spirit in ways that would make individuals incapable of resistance or independent thought. The prayer circles also served as a means of preserving information that might otherwise be lost or forgotten. Lydia insisted that detailed accounts of everything they learned about the missing family be memorized by multiple individuals, ensuring that evidence of what was happening would survive, even if those who gathered it were punished or sold to other plantations. As winter turned toward spring,
these gatherings began to evolve into something more active than mere information sharing. The realization that the Brooks family's fate could befall any of them at any time had created a sense of urgency that overcame the caution and resignation that typically characterized plantation life. For the first time in the plantation's history, enslaved workers began discussing not just survival strategies, but the possibility of active resistance. Meanwhile, word of the Blackwood Plantation's experimental program had begun to spread among the white community as well, though in very different terms than the whispered fears circulating through the slave quarters. Several plantation owners from neighboring counties had requested meetings with Amelia to learn about her innovative management techniques, and there was growing speculation that her methods might be adopted more widely throughout the region. This outside interest created additional pressure for Amelia to produce demonstrable results from her experimental program. The 7 members of the Brooks family were no longer just subjects for her personal research. They had become proof of concept for methods that might revolutionize plantation management throughout the Antebellum South. Their complete psychological breakdown and transformation into perfectly obedient workers would establish Amelia as a pioneer in plantation efficiency. While any failure might discredit both her methods and her reputation among the planter elite, the approaching spring planting season would provide the ultimate test for whether Amelia's experimental subjects had been successfully transformed into the kind of workers she had promised. But as the days grew longer and warmer, events were already in motion that would ensure her experiment would be remembered for very different reasons than she had anticipated.
March 1823 brought unseasonably warm weather to Mobile County, along with the intensive preparations that preceded spring planting season. Across the plantation, enslaved workers prepared fields, repaired equipment, and organized supplies for the months of intensive labor that would determine the year's cotton crop and the plantation's financial success. For Amelia, the approaching planting season represented the culmination of her experimental program. After 5 months of systematic psychological manipulation, the 7 members of the Brooks family would be integrated back into the plantation's general labor force, where their transformed behavior would demonstrate the effectiveness of her methods to both her husband and the growing number of plantation owners who had expressed interest in similar programs. But the individuals subjected to Amelia's experiment had undergone changes far different from what she had intended. Rather than becoming broken, compliant workers focused solely on their assigned tasks, they had developed something much more dangerous, a shared understanding that their survival depended on eliminating the source of their torment, regardless of the consequences. The transformation had begun with Nathan Brooks, the youngest of the adult siblings, whose natural leadership abilities had made him a particular target for Amelia's psychological manipulation techniques. Repeated attempts to break his spirit through punishment and isolation had instead fostered a cold, calculating intelligence that focused entirely on finding ways to strike back against those who had destroyed his family. Working in isolation, denied communication with his relative, Nathan had spent the winter months memorizing every detail of the building's layout, the routines of the overseers, and the patterns of Amelia's visits. He had observed which doors remained unlocked during different times of day, where tools and potential weapons were stored, and how sound carried between different sections of the building. More importantly, Nathan had found ways to communicate with his family members despite Amelia's elaborate isolation protocols. Through a system of coded sounds, hidden messages, and carefully timed gestures, the Brooks family had maintained contact and begun coordinating their responses to their captors' demands. What appeared to be the gradual breakdown of family bonds was actually the development of a sophisticated conspiracy focused on a single objective: escape or revenge. The breaking point came on March 15th when Amelia decided to implement what she called the final integration test. Eliza Brooks's 6-year-old daughter, little Emma, would be separated from her mother permanently and assigned to work in the main house, where her mother would be able to see her daily but never speak to her again. This separation, Amelia explained to her overseers, would demonstrate whether the psychological conditioning had been successful in eliminating inappropriate emotional attachments that interfered with work efficiency. But when the overseers came to collect Emma that morning, they found the Brooks family prepared for something very different than passive compliance. The months of systematic torture had indeed transformed them,
but not into broken, obedient workers. They had become a coordinated unit focused entirely on survival and retribution, with nothing left to lose and no remaining faith that submission would protect them from further cruelty. The confrontation began when Nathan Brooks refused to allow the overseers to take his niece. His defiance was not the desperate resistance of someone acting on impulse, but the calculated challenge of someone who had prepared for this moment for months. When the first overseer moved to strike Nathan for his insubordination, he found himself facing not one individual, but the combined resistance of 7 people who had decided that death was preferable to continued torture. What followed was not the chaotic violence of desperate people, but the systematic execution of a plan that had been developed over months of careful observation and preparation. The Brooks family had identified their captor's weaknesses, learned the building's vulnerabilities, and prepared themselves for the consequences of active resistance. When the moment came, they were ready. The 2 overseers assigned to guard them were experienced in controlling individual slaves through intimidation and punishment,
but they were unprepared for coordinated resistance from a group that no longer feared death. Within minutes, both men were dead, killed not in a frenzy of anger, but through the careful application of tools and techniques that Nathan and his family had planned, with the same precision Amelia had used to design their torment. But killing their immediate captors was only the beginning of what the Brooks family had planned for this day. They had spent months listening to Amelia's daily visits, memorizing her routines, and preparing for the opportunity to confront the person truly responsible for their suffering. And on the morning of March 15th, they knew exactly where to find her. Amelia Blackwood began March 15th with the same methodical approach she had applied to every aspect of her experimental program. After breakfast with her husband in the main house dining room, she collected her daily observation notes, gathered the supplies needed for the morning's integration test, and set out along the familiar path through the pine forest toward the remote building where her subjects awaited her arrival. The morning air carried the sweet scent of early spring flowers and the sounds of plantation life beginning another day. Field hands were already at work preparing for the coming planting season, their voices and the sounds of their tools creating a backdrop of productive activity that reinforced Amelia's conviction that her experimental methods would soon revolutionize plantation management throughout the South. She walked with the confident stride of someone who had never encountered resistance she could not overcome through careful planning and systematic application of pressure. The 5 months of her experimental program had proceeded exactly according to her expectations, with each of the 7 subjects showing precisely the kind of psychological transformation that would make them ideal workers once they were integrated back into the plantation's general labor force. What Amelia discovered when she reached the building was a scene that would haunt the nightmares of everyone who witnessed it for the rest of their lives. The 2 overseers lay dead in the central instruction room, killed with tools and techniques that demonstrated both planning and intimate knowledge of human anatomy. But far more disturbing than their deaths was the evidence of systematic preparation that surrounded their bodies. The Brooks family had used their months of confinement to transform the building into something very different from what Amelia had intended. Tools had been modified into weapons. Escape routes had been prepared, and supplies had been gathered for what was clearly a carefully planned confrontation rather than a spontaneous act of violence. But most disturbing of all was the realization that the 7 individuals she had believed were broken and compliant had instead been watching her, learning her routines, studying her vulnerabilities, and preparing for this moment with the same methodical precision she had used to design their torment. Nathan Brooks stood in the center of the instruction room, no longer the psychologically shattered individual Amelia believed she had created, but someone whose intelligence and determination had been focused entirely on survival and retribution. His family stood with him, arranged not in the random positions of desperate people, but in the coordinated formation of individuals who had planned every detail of what would happen next. "Mistress Amelia," Nathan said, his voice carrying none of the deference and submission that 5 months of torture were supposed to have instilled. "We have been waiting for you to arrive. We have something we want to discuss." What followed
was not a conversation in any conventional sense, but rather the methodical presentation of a case that the Brooks family had prepared over months of careful observation and analysis. They had documented every aspect of Amelia's experimental program, memorized every detail of her methods, and prepared a comprehensive account of what had been done to them and why. But their purpose was not simply to confront their tormentor with evidence of her cruelty. The Brooks family had realized that Amelia's experimental program was intended as a model for wider implementation, and that their suffering was designed to establish methods that would be applied to enslaved individuals throughout the region.
Their escape would not save others from similar fate unless they took steps to ensure that Amelia's methods died with her program. Nathan Brooks had become something far more dangerous than a rebellious slave. He had become someone who understood exactly how the plantation system worked, who could anticipate the responses of authorities to slave rebellion, and who had developed a comprehensive plan not just for escape, but for ensuring that evidence of Amelia's experiments would reach people capable of taking action to prevent similar programs. The confrontation that morning was not the desperate violence of people with nothing left to lose, but the calculated execution of justice by individuals who had been transformed by their suffering into something their captors had never anticipated. When Amelia's body was discovered later that day, the manner of her death would tell a story that authorities would spend decades trying to suppress. But the Brooks family's plan extended far beyond personal revenge. They had prepared evidence, gathered documentation, and established contacts that would ensure their story reached ears beyond the local authorities, who might be motivated to cover up scandals that could damage the reputation of prominent plantation families. Colonel Elias Blackwood discovered his wife's body on the afternoon of March 15th, when her failure to return from her daily visit to the experimental facility had become cause for concern. What he found in the remote building would reshape not only his understanding of his wife's activities, but the entire trajectory of his life and the legacy of his family name. Amelia lay in the central instruction room, surrounded by evidence of the experimental program that had consumed her attention for the previous 5 months. But rather than the scene of random violence that might be expected from a slave rebellion, Blackwood encountered something far more disturbing: the systematic documentation and presentation of evidence that revealed the true nature of what his wife had been doing to the 7 members of the Brooks family. The building itself had been transformed into what could only be described as a museum of cruelty, with every tool, every restraining device, and every psychological manipulation technique carefully arranged and labeled to demonstrate the comprehensive nature of Amelia's experimental program. Written documentation, including Amelia's own detailed notes, had been organized and presented in a manner that would leave no doubt about the deliberate, systematic nature of what had been done to the missing family. Most disturbing of all was a comprehensive written account, obviously prepared over many weeks, that detailed not only what had been done to the Brooks family, but Amelia's plans for expanding her methods throughout the plantation, and her correspondence with other plantation owners who had expressed interest in similar programs. The document revealed that what Blackwood had understood as an isolated experiment was actually intended as the foundation for a regional transformation of plantation management techniques. The Brooks family themselves had vanished completely, leaving behind only the evidence of their months of suffering and a clear indication that their escape had been planned with the same systematic precision that characterized everything else about the confrontation. They had taken nothing that belonged to the plantation, destroyed nothing beyond what was necessary to eliminate their captors, and left behind a complete record that would make any cover-up attempt extraordinarily difficult. Blackwood's immediate concern was preventing the discovery from becoming public knowledge that would destroy not only his own reputation, but the standing of every plantation owner who had been associated with Amelia's experimental program. Within hours of finding his wife's body,
He had dispatched trusted riders to contact other members of the planter elite who needed to be warned about the potential scandal and enlisted in efforts to control the narrative. The response was swift and coordinated. By evening, representatives from some of the most powerful families in Alabama had arrived at the Blackwood plantation to assess the situation and develop strategies for preventing the truth about Amelia's experimental program from reaching authorities or newspapers that might use the information to attack the entire plantation system. What they discovered was evidence so damning that traditional cover-up methods would be inadequate. The systematic nature of Amelia's cruelty, the involvement of other plantation owners in planning similar programs, and the comprehensive documentation left behind by the Brooks family created risks that extended far beyond damage to individual reputations.
The decision was made to implement what they called comprehensive suppression, a coordinated effort that involved local law enforcement, regional newspapers, and political authorities at the state level. The official story would be that Amelia Blackwood had been killed during a random slave rebellion that was quickly suppressed, with the perpetrators captured and executed to prevent similar incidents. But creating a believable alternative narrative required eliminating all evidence of the experimental program, including the building itself and everyone who had knowledge of what had actually occurred. Over the following weeks, a systematic campaign of intimidation, bribery, and threats would be implemented to ensure that no one who had witnessed evidence of Amelia's activities would be willing or able to share that information with outside authorities. The two overseers who had been killed were described as victims of unprovoked violence, with no mention of their role in Amelia's experimental program. The 7 members of the Brooks family were reported as captured and executed, though no bodies were ever produced and no public executions took place. The remote building was dismantled completely, with its materials burned and scattered to eliminate any physical evidence of what had occurred there. Most importantly, the comprehensive written account left behind by the Brooks family was declared too dangerous to allow survival in any form. Multiple copies had apparently been prepared, and tracking down every version would require resources and coordination that extended across state boundaries and involved individuals whose own reputations depended on keeping the truth buried. What the conspirators could not have anticipated was that their efforts to suppress evidence of Amelia's experimental program would create exactly the kind of mystery and speculation that would keep the story alive for generations. Their success in eliminating official records would transform the Blackwood plantation tragedy into the kind of legend that would be whispered about in slave quarters and abolitionist meetings for decades to come. The coordinated cover-up effort that followed Amelia's death succeeded in preventing immediate public exposure of her experimental program, but it could not prevent the systematic destruction of everything the Blackwood family had built over 2 generations. Within months of the March 15th incident, forces had been set in motion that would reduce Colonel Elias Blackwood from one of Alabama's most respected planters to a broken man whose family name would become synonymous with scandal and shame. The first indication that the cover-up was failing came in late April, when unsigned letters began appearing in the offices of abolitionist newspapers throughout the North. These letters contained detailed descriptions of Amelia's experimental program, accompanied by information that could only have come from someone with intimate knowledge of both the plantation's operations and the subsequent cover-up efforts. The letters were clearly written by someone with education and sophisticated understanding of how to present evidence in ways that would be credible to skeptical readers. They included specific details about plantation layouts, names of overseers, descriptions of equipment used in the experimental program, and, most damaging of all, direct quotes from correspondence between Amelia and other plantation owners who had expressed interest in implementing similar methods. What made these revelations particularly devastating was their timing. The abolitionist movement was gaining momentum throughout the North, and evidence of systematic torture programs on Southern plantations provided exactly the kind of documentation that reformers needed to support their arguments about the inherent brutality of the slavery system. Within weeks, the Blackwood plantation story had become a centerpiece of anti-slavery publications and speaking tours. But the real destruction came from within the Southern planter community itself.
The other plantation owners who had been associated with Amelia's experimental program found themselves facing questions they could not answer without admitting their own involvement in planning systematic torture. One by one, they began distancing themselves from Blackwood, canceling business relationships, and spreading rumors designed to shift blame entirely onto the colonel and his deceased wife. By summer 1823, Blackwood had been effectively ostracized from the social and business networks that formed the foundation of plantation society. Banks that had previously competed for his business suddenly found reasons to call in loans or refuse credit extensions.
Merchants who had provided supplies for decades began demanding immediate payment for goods that had traditionally been purchased on seasonal credit arrangements. Most devastating of all, other plantation owners began actively discouraging their enslaved workers from any contact with Blackwood's plantation, treating it as a source of dangerous ideas about resistance and rebellion. The economic pressure was accompanied by political isolation that made Blackwood's situation increasingly precarious. His military rank, which had opened doors throughout Alabama's political establishment, became a liability as officials worried that association with him might damage their own reputations. Invitations to social gatherings stopped arriving, business partnerships dissolved without explanation, and former friends found excuses to avoid encounters that might be observed by others. But perhaps most devastating was the effect on the plantation enslaved population. Word of the Brooks family's successful resistance had spread throughout the region, creating what authorities described as dangerous excitement among enslaved individuals who had previously accepted their situation with resignation. The Blackwood plantation became a symbol of successful resistance, and maintaining control over the remaining workers required increasingly expensive security measures that further strained the plantation's deteriorating finances. Lydia Freeman, the elderly cook who had organized the prayer circles during the winter months, had become something more than a community leader among the enslaved population. Her efforts to document and preserve information about the Brooks family's fate had evolved into a comprehensive intelligence network that extended across multiple plantations and even into the free black communities of Mobile itself. Through this network, detailed information about plantation vulnerabilities, overseer weaknesses, and opportunities for resistance was being shared and coordinated in ways that had never existed before the Blackwood incident. What had begun as an attempt to preserve the memory of 7 tortured individuals had become the foundation for organized resistance activities that terrified plantation owners throughout the region. The final blow to Blackwood's dynasty came in autumn 1823, when a series of coordinated incidents across multiple plantations demonstrated that the Brooks family's resistance had inspired something far more dangerous than isolated acts of rebellion. Overseers began disappearing, equipment was systematically sabotaged, and crops were destroyed in ways that suggested careful planning rather than random violence. Most alarming to authorities was evidence that the resistance activities were being coordinated by individuals who possessed detailed knowledge of plantation operations, security procedures, and personal vulnerabilities of owners and overseers. The systematic nature of the attacks suggested that someone with intimate understanding of how the plantation system functioned was directing activities designed to destroy it from within. Colonel Blackwood's attempts to maintain control over his own plantation became increasingly desperate and expensive. He hired additional overseers, implemented new security measures, and even constructed fortified buildings designed to protect against coordinated attacks. But each new precaution required resources he could no longer afford, while demonstrating to the remaining enslaved population that their resistance was having the desired effect. By December 1823, the plantation that had once been the pride of Mobile County had become something closer to an armed camp, with guards patrolling constantly, workers confined to quarters except during supervised labor periods, and an atmosphere of suspicion and fear that made productive work nearly impossible. The cotton crop had failed completely, livestock had been lost to systematic sabotage, and the buildings themselves showed signs of deliberate damage that occurred despite round-the-clock security measures.
The end came not through dramatic confrontation, but through the simple arithmetic of financial collapse. Blackwood could no longer afford to maintain the security measures necessary to protect his plantation, but he could not risk reducing them without inviting the kind of comprehensive destruction that had befallen other properties in the region. Faced with bankruptcy and the certainty that his situation would only worsen, he made the decision that would complete the destruction of his family's legacy. On January 3, 1824, Colonel Elias Blackwood made an announcement that sent shockwaves through Alabama's planter elite and provided the final piece of evidence that abolitionists needed to document the systematic brutality underlying the plantation system. Standing in the parlor of his crumbling mansion, surrounded by furniture that would soon be sold to pay creditors, he confessed the full truth about his wife's experimental program and his own role in concealing evidence of her crimes. The confession was not motivated by remorse or moral awakening, but by the calculated recognition that his enemies already possessed enough information to destroy him completely. While his former allies had abandoned him to protect their own interests, by controlling the narrative of his own downfall, Blackwood hoped to salvage some remnant of dignity while ensuring that others who had participated in planning similar experimental programs would face consequences for their involvement. What Blackwood revealed was a network of correspondence and collaboration that extended far beyond his own plantation. Amelia's experimental program had been designed as a pilot project for methods that would be implemented across dozens of plantations throughout Alabama, Georgia, and Mississippi. The systematic torture techniques she had developed were intended to become standard practices that would revolutionize plantation management and increase profits by breaking the human spirit so completely that resistance would become psychologically impossible. The confession included names, dates, and specific details about other plantation owners who had provided funding, advice, and resources for Amelia's experiments. It revealed that the innovative management techniques discussed at their wedding had been the culmination of months of coordination among some of the South's most prominent families, all of whom had agreed to implement similar programs on their own properties once Amelia's methods had been proven effective. Most damaging of all, Blackwood's confession revealed that local authorities, including sheriffs, judges, and political officials, had been informed about the experimental program and had agreed to provide protection from legal consequences in exchange for promises that successful techniques would be shared with their own business interests. The cover-up effort that followed Amelia's death involved coordinated perjury, destruction of evidence, and intimidation of witnesses at levels that reached into the highest circles of state government. But Blackwood's confession also revealed information that he could not have intended to make public. Details about the Brooks family's escape that demonstrated their resistance had been far more sophisticated and far-reaching than anyone had suspected. According to documents he had recovered during his investigation of the March 15th incident, the 7 family members had not simply fled to freedom, but had established contact with abolitionist networks that enabled them to provide detailed intelligence about plantation vulnerabilities throughout the region. Nathan Brooks, the young man whose leadership had coordinated his family's resistance, had apparently possessed abilities that went far beyond what any plantation owner had recognized. His understanding of the plantation system's weaknesses, his ability to forge connections across racial and social boundaries, and his talent for organizing coordinated resistance activities had made him something unprecedented in the antebellum South, an enslaved individual who had become a strategic threat to the entire system of human bondage.
The intelligence network that Nathan Brooks had established was providing information that enabled resistance activities, escape routes, and even economic sabotage that was coordinated across state boundaries. Plantation owners who had never heard of the Blackwood experimental program found themselves dealing with equipment failures, crop diseases, and worker reliability problems that seemed to strike multiple properties simultaneously in ways that suggested deliberate coordination. Blackwood's confession revealed that authorities had tracked some of this activity to contacts in northern cities where former enslaved individuals
were providing information and resources that enabled increasingly sophisticated resistance operations. The Brooks family had not simply escaped to freedom, they had become part of a growing network of individuals whose intimate knowledge of plantation operations was being used to systematically undermine the economic foundation of the slavery system. What terrified Southern authorities more than individual acts of rebellion was evidence that enslaved individuals were developing the kind of organizational capabilities and strategic thinking that had previously been considered impossible under the conditions of bondage. The Blackwood incident had demonstrated that systematic cruelty, designed to break human spirit, could instead forge individuals into something far more dangerous than compliant workers. The confession's most shocking revelation concerned the ultimate fate of Amelia herself. According to documents that Blackwood had discovered but initially concealed, his wife had not been killed during the March 15th confrontation. Instead, she had been taken alive by the Brooks family, who had subjected her to a carefully planned psychological demonstration of her own experimental techniques before allowing her to die from injuries that were inflicted with the same systematic precision she had used to torture others. The evidence suggested that Amelia had spent her final hours experiencing every technique she had developed for breaking human spirit, administered by individuals who had intimate knowledge of her methods and unlimited motivation to ensure she understood exactly how her victims had suffered. Her death had been neither quick nor merciful, but rather a comprehensive education in the consequences of treating other human beings as experimental subjects for systematic cruelty. This mystery shows us that the greatest horrors in American history often emerge not from supernatural forces, but from the calculated cruelty that humans can inflict upon one another when they convince themselves that some lives matter less than others. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or do you think there are still secrets buried in the Mobile County archives? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. The shadows of America's past hold many more secrets waiting to be uncovered, and we'll be here to explore them with you. The Blackwood Plantation was abandoned in February 1824, its buildings left to decay, while creditors fought over assets that proved insufficient to cover the colonel's debts. Elias Blackwood himself disappeared shortly after making his confession, with some reports suggesting he had fled to Mexico, while others claimed he had taken his own life rather than face the consequences of his revelations. But the true legacy of the Blackwood incident extended far beyond the destruction of a single family's fortune. The experimental program that Amelia had designed and the resistance network that the Brooks family had inspired became symbols that influenced both the abolitionist movement and the evolution of plantation management techniques throughout the antebellum period. In the North, detailed accounts of Amelia's systematic torture methods provided abolitionists with documentation that supported their arguments about the inherent brutality of slavery. The Blackwood Confession became required reading in anti-slavery societies and helped convince previously neutral observers that the plantation system was fundamentally incompatible with Christian values and American principles of human dignity. More importantly, the story of the Brooks family's successful resistance became a source of inspiration for enslaved individuals throughout the South who had previously accepted their situation as unchangeable. The knowledge that 7 people had not only survived systematic torture, but had successfully escaped and established networks for helping others demonstrated that resistance was possible even under the most oppressive conditions. The intelligence networks that Nathan Brooks had established continued operating long after the Blackwood Plantation's collapse, providing information and resources that enabled escape routes, resistance activities, and economic sabotage that contributed to the growing instability of the slavery system. By the 1850s, plantation owners throughout the region were dealing with problems that seemed to indicate coordinated opposition rather than isolated incidents of rebellion. Perhaps most significantly, the Blackwood incident demonstrated that systematic cruelty, designed to break human spirit, could instead forge individuals into something far more dangerous than compliant workers. The 7 members of the Brooks family
had been transformed by their suffering into strategic thinkers whose understanding of the plantation system's vulnerabilities enabled them to strike back in ways that their tormentors had never anticipated. The abandoned Blackwood plantation became a destination for curious visitors and a source of local legends that persisted well into the 20th century. Stories circulated about mysterious lights in the ruins of the main house, unexplained sounds from the location where the experimental building had stood, and sightings of figures that seemed to be searching for something among the overgrown cotton fields. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Blackwood tragedy was its demonstration that the greatest horrors in human history often emerge not from supernatural forces, but from the calculated decisions of individuals who convince themselves that some lives matter less than others. The systematic torture that Amelia had designed was not the product of mental illness or sudden passion, but of careful planning by educated, socially prominent individuals who had rationalized cruelty as business innovation. The documents that survived the cover-up effort, scattered across archives from Mobile to Boston, continue to provide historians with evidence of how the plantation system functioned and how resistance networks developed in response to systematic oppression. The Blackwood Papers, as they came to be known, offer rare insight into both the brutal calculations that sustained human bondage and the sophisticated strategies that enslaved individuals developed to resist and ultimately undermine their oppressors. Today, the site where the Blackwood plantation once stood is marked only by foundation stones and a historical marker that provides a sanitized account of the property's significance in the region's agricultural development. But for those who know where to look, evidence remains of the experimental building where 7 individuals endured months of systematic torture before transforming their suffering into the foundation for a resistance network that would contribute to the eventual collapse of the system that had enslaved them. The true story of Colonel Elias Blackwood and his wife's wedding gift of 7 human beings serves as a reminder that the shadows of America's past continue to shape our present, and that the greatest historical lessons often come from confronting the uncomfortable truths about what humans are capable of doing to one another. When systems of power convince them that cruelty can be justified, it is progress.